startup one day. If you want to start a startup one day, what do you do now in college? There are only two things you need initially: an idea and co-founders. And the MO for getting them both is the same, which leads to our sixth and last counterintuitive point. The way to get startup ideas is not to try to think of startup ideas. I've written a whole essay on this, and I'm not going to repeat the whole thing here. But the short version is that if you make a conscious effort to try and think of startup ideas, you will think of ideas that are not only bad, but bad and plausible sounding, meaning you and everybody else will be fooled by them and you'll waste a lot of time before realizing they're no good. The way to come up with good startup ideas is to take a step back. Instead of trying to make a conscious effort to think of startup ideas, turn your brain into the type that has startup ideas unconsciously. In fact, so unconsciously that you don't even realize at first that they're startup ideas. This is not only possible. Yahoo, Google, Facebook, and Apple all got started this way. None of these companies were even supposed to be companies at first. They were all just side projects. The very best ideas almost have to start as side projects because they're always such outliers that your conscious mind would reject them as ideas for companies. Okay? So how do you turn your mind into the kind that has startup ideas unconsciously? 1, learn a lot about things that matter. 2, work on problems that interest you. 3, with people you like and respect. That third part, incidentally, is how you get co-founders at the same time as the idea. The first time I wrote that paragraph, instead of learn a lot about things that matter, I wrote, become good at some technology. But that prescription, though sufficient, is too narrow. What was special about Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia from Airbnb was not that they were experts in technology. They went to art school. They were experts in design, and perhaps even more importantly, they were really good at organizing people and getting projects done. So you don't have to work on technology per se, so long as you work on things that stretch you. What kind of things are those? Now that is very hard to answer in the general case. History is full of examples of young people who were working on problems that no one else at the time thought were important, and in particular, that their parents didn't think they were important. On the other hand, history is even fuller of examples of parents who thought their kids were wasting their time and who were right. So, how do you know if you're working on real stuff? I mean, when Twitch TV switched from being Justin.tv to Twitch TV and they were going to broadcast people playing video games, I was like, what? But it turned out to be a good business. Well, I know how I know real problems are interesting, and I'm self-indulgent. I'm always interested in working on interesting things, even if no one else cares about them, and I find it very hard to make myself work on boring things, even if they're supposed to be important. My life is full of case after case where I worked on things just because I was interested, and they turned out to be useful later in some worldly way. Y Combinator itself is something I only did because it seemed interesting. So I seem to have some sort of internal compass that helps me out. But this is for you, not me, and I don't know what you have in your heads. Maybe if I think more about it, I could come up with some heuristics for recognizing genuinely interesting ideas. But for now, all I can give you is the hopelessly question-begging advice. Incidentally, this is the actual meaning of the phrase, begging the question. The hopelessly question-begging advice that if you're interested in genuinely interesting problems, gratifying your interest energetically is the best way to prepare yourself for a startup. And for that matter, probably the best way to live. But although I can't explain in the general case what counts as an interesting problem, I can tell you about a large subset of them. If you think of technology as something that's spreading like a sort of fractal stain, every point on the edge that's moving represents an interesting problem. Steam engines, not so much, although maybe, you never know. So one guaranteed way to turn your mind into the type that startup ideas form in unconsciously is to get yourself to the leading edge of some technology, to as Paul Buchheit put it, live in the future. And when you get there, Ideas that seem uncannily prescient to other people will seem obvious to you. You may not realize they're startup ideas, but you'll know there's something that ought to exist. For example, back at Harvard, back in the mid-90s, a fellow grad student of my friends Robert and Trevor wrote his own voice-over IP software. It wasn't meant to be a startup. He never tried to turn it into one. He just wanted to talk to his girlfriend in Taiwan without paying for long-distance calls. And since he was an expert on networks, it seemed obvious to him that the thing to do was turn the sound into packets and ship them over the internet for free. Why didn't everybody do this? Well, because they weren't good at writing that kind of software. He never did anything with this. He never tried to turn it into a startup, but that is how all the best startups tend to happen. So strangely enough, the optimal thing to do in college if you want to be a successful startup founder is not some sort of new vocational version of college focused on entrepreneurship. It's the classic version of college as education for its own sake. If you want to start a startup, what you should do in college is learn powerful things. And if you have genuine intellectual curiosity, that's what you'll naturally tend to do if you just follow your own inclinations. The component of entrepreneurship, I can never quite say that word with a straight face, that really matters is domain expertise. Larry Page is Larry Page because he was an expert on search. And the way he became an expert on search was because he was genuinely interested in it, not because of some ulterior motive. At its best, starting a startup is merely an ulterior motive for curiosity, and you'll do it best if you introduce the ulterior motive at the end of the process. So here is the ultimate advice for young would-be startup founders, reduced to 2 words. Just learn. All right, how much time do we have left?
18 minutes.
And the MO for getting them both is the same, which leads to our sixth and last counterintuitive.